The first thing you need to know is that some truths were never meant to see the light of day. 8 seconds is all it takes to change everything you thought you knew about history, about morality, about what humans are capable of when power whispers in their ear. In the remote hills of Black Ridge, 1874, a baroness, known to society as a charitable widow, a mother, a woman of elegance, lived a life that concealed a darkness so absolute, it would make the faint of heart look away. The village knew her as someone generous with her wealth, someone who offered shelter and employment to the miners who toiled in the nearby shafts. They never knew the cost of her charity, the unspeakable bargains she struck behind closed doors. The night air in Black Ridge was thick with smoke and a metallic tang of iron, the kind that seeps into your lungs and never leaves. That same air carried whispers, rumors dismissed by polite society, about daughters disappearing, children who vanished like smoke, leaving only faint echoes in the corridors of her grand mansion. But the real horror, the truth buried in account ledgers and whispered confessions, was far more calculated than the villagers imagined. The Baroness had discovered a way to turn innocence into currency. Her daughters, some born, some adopted, some merely entrusted to her care, were offered to the miners as part of secret contracts she orchestrated, a system of barter so perverse it blurred the line between wealth and blood. And here's the part history books won't tell you. This was not mere lust or madness. This was methodical, deliberate. Every step was calculated to maintain her power, to protect her family name, to ensure that the machinery of Black Ridge's economy ran on the flesh of the innocent without question. The miners, desperate, complicit, fearful of losing their livelihoods, became unintentional enforcers. The Baroness understood human desire better than any moral code, better than any law. She manipulated it like a master pianist, and every missing daughter, every hushed transaction, every fearful glance from a villager became a note in her symphony of control. By the time you leave this story, you will understand that evil does not always roar. Sometimes, it smiles politely at you from a gilded window, hiding the chains and contracts beneath silk and lace. And if you think this is an isolated atrocity, you are already trapped in the comforting lie that keeps the powerful safe. To understand the Baroness, you must first understand the landscape of Black Ridge itself, a town carved from stone and despair. The miners arrived at dawn, their hands calloused, their backs bent under the weight of iron and coal. They were proud men in their own right, yet beneath that pride lurked a hunger that the Baroness knew how to exploit. She watched them as one might watch ants, each step predictable, each weakness catalogued and stored for the right moment. And she did not act on impulse. She acted with precision. Her daughters were trained early, not in school or social graces, but in the art of invisibility. They learned how to be unseen until they were needed, how to speak just enough to please, how to smile without emotion. It was not cruelty born from madness. It was an education in survival that she weaponized against them. Every bedtime story whispered to them by the Baroness carried a hidden lesson. Obedience is power. Fear is currency. Desire is leverage. By the time the first girl was offered to the miners, she understood exactly what her role was, and how little anyone outside her family would question it. The miners, meanwhile, were complicit in their ignorance. Some claimed they were unaware. Others whispered that resistance would have meant starvation, exile, or worse. The truth was darker. They understood perfectly well, but they were bound by chains they could not see. The invisible web of social expectation, economic dependency, and primal desire. The Baroness's genius was in exploiting that invisible web. She knew that humans are remarkably pliable when their survival is at stake, that morality bends when the alternative is annihilation. And so, one by one, her daughters were drawn into transactions that left the miners with wealth, with pleasure, with guilt, but never with the courage to speak. Black Ridge became a theater of the unseen. Every corridor of the mansion, every path through the village, every shadow cast by the mining towers carried its own secret. People spoke of missing daughters, but always with the careful hesitation of those who feared reprisal. Letters were intercepted, whispers silenced, and anyone who asked too many questions simply vanished. The Baroness's power extended far beyond her wealth. It was a psychological dominion, a manipulation so complete that it turned her neighbors into silent accomplices. By now, you may feel unease creeping in, a discomfort that is not just about history, but about the mechanisms that allow it. The Baroness is no anomaly. She is the mirror you refuse to look into, a reflection of control, calculation, and cruelty hidden behind civility. And this is only the beginning. The Feist transaction was not announced with fanfare. There was no public trial, no confession, no scandal. It happened quietly, in the pre-dawn hours, when the town was still wrapped in mist and the miner's shadows stretched long and thin over the frozen ground. A girl of barely 12, her eyes wide with curiosity and terror, was led to the edge of the mine, her small hands trembling, her pulse a wild drum in the silent hills. The Baroness watched from the doorway, a silent conductor, her expression unreadable, every movement deliberate. She understood that the most potent form of control is not force. It is anticipation, the slow, crushing weight of inevitability that convinces the victim that resistance is meaningless. The miners, fully aware of what was being asked of them, accepted the arrangement with a mixture of awe, fear, and reluctant desire. In the darkness, they had no choice but to obey the subtle tyranny of the Baroness, who had taught them, through years of small, coercive lessons, that survival required compliance. Every nod, every whispered command, every fleeting glance between them and the girl was a testament to the unspoken rules of this system, a hierarchy where the Baroness sat unchallenged, untouchable, her power absolute. But here's what history will never print. The girl did not simply vanish into the mine. She became part of a ritualized system, a chain of influence and exploitation that reached far beyond Black Ridge. Each transaction was recorded in secret ledgers, each act of compliance noted and rewarded with wealth, gifts, and social approval. It was not chaos, it was architecture, a meticulously designed system of psychological and economic domination. The Baroness understood that control is most effective when it appears natural, inevitable, almost invisible. She constructed an empire of obedience, using fear, desire, and twisted maternal authority as the pillars. And, yet, despite the horror, there was a method to her madness that few could see. She framed every act, every arrangement, as necessary for the prosperity of the village, for the continuation of her family line, for the survival of those who might otherwise suffer. This rationalization is familiar, even seductive, because it mirrors the very mechanisms societies use to justify atrocities. She made the unthinkable seem practical, moral even, and by doing so, she ensured that complicity became instinct. By the time the sun rose over Black Ridge, the girl had returned to the mansion, changed in ways no one could articulate. Fear had already begun its slow work, bending her mind, shaping her obedience, sealing her into a reality where the Baroness's power was law, unchallengeable and eternal. This was the beginning of the descent, the first step into a darkness that few survive to understand, and fewer still are willing to confront. The Baroness did not stop with one daughter, nor with one miner. She understood a truth that few ever grasp. Fear, once planted, grows exponentially. It spreads through communities like wildfire, unseen yet inevitable, shaping behavior, thought, and loyalty. In Black Ridge, every shadow, every rumor, every unexplained absence became a tool she wielded with precision. She did not rely on brute force alone. She relied on the invisible architecture of control, the subtle pressure of expectation, the quiet terror of gossip, the unspoken understanding that the price of disobedience was disappearance, or worse. Miners who once walked with pride began to shuffle their steps, eyes lowered, hands trembling over tools that now felt like instruments of complicity. They were trapped in a system they had helped sustain, a system that required obedience to survive. Their loyalty was not earned. It was coerced, cultivated over years of whispered threats, subtle rewards, and the constant presence of the Baroness's gaze, which carried more weight than any law. Every act of compliance reinforced her power, and every hesitation invited scrutiny. The Baroness expanded her influence with methodical precision. Families who had once been independent became dependent on her favor. She lent money, offered employment, and provided social advancement, but all came with invisible strings. One could not speak against her, could not question her, could not act outside her carefully constructed rules. Every transaction, every whispered threat, every gift given with one hand and a demand withheld in the other was a lesson in obedience. She had transformed Black Ridge into a microcosm of psychological domination, a laboratory for human behavior under extreme coercion. And the daughters, each was trained, each observed, each subtly conditioned to accept her fate. Fear was instilled not through cruelty alone but through the illusion of inevitability. The Baroness knew that the mind bends most effectively when it believes it has no alternative. Every whispered warning, every absence of a friend or sibling, every glance from an adult imbued with silent authority, told them one thing: resistance is futile. Survival demands compliance. Desire must be leveraged. Innocence is currency. By now, the village was silent, complicit, aware yet powerless. They watched as families were fractured, as lives were bent to the Baroness's will, as morality became a negotiable commodity. And this silence, this collective acquiescence, was the Baroness's greatest victory. It is a lesson buried in the shadows of history. True power does not shout. It manipulates. It orchestrates. It bends the willing and the fearful alike into instruments of its design. The daughters' lives became a sequence of invisible chains. Each day, they awoke not to freedom, but to schedules, lessons, and rituals designed to mold them into instruments of survival and compliance. Fear was their tutor, desire their prison. The Baroness understood that terror alone could not sustain control. It needed balance, a rhythm that alternated punishment and reward. A smile at the right moment, a whispered praise for obedience, a carefully timed gift. These were not acts of kindness. They were reinforcement, a conditioning of the psyche that bound them ever tighter to her will. The miners watched. Some justified their participation as necessity, some as inevitability. Others succumbed to greed, lust, or the intoxicating illusion of power the Baroness offered them. And yet, no matter how much they told themselves it was harmless, every choice etched guilt deep into their bones. There was no escape from complicity. Every act they took to secure their position, every unspoken compliance, made them part of the machinery that destroyed innocence and shaped the Baroness's empire. They became instruments of her design, carrying her control far beyond the mansion, spreading its influence into the veins of the village itself. The psychological mechanisms in play were extraordinary. The Baroness had mastered the art of invisible dominance. She orchestrated fear and desire simultaneously, ensuring that resistance was not only terrifying but inconceivable. Obedience became instinct. Silence became safety. The daughters learned to read glances, anticipate threats, and suppress outrage before it even rose in their chests. In this environment, trauma was weaponized as education, manipulation disguised as guidance, and suffering refined into power. The village, too, became a participant in its own oppression. Neighbors avoided looking too closely at absences, too loudly at whispers, too honestly at the machinery of corruption before them. Social bonds fractured under the weight of fear and complicity. Every secret kept, every truth hidden, every glance turned away reinforced the Baroness's dominion. Black Ridge was no longer a town. It was an ecosystem of control, every individual a component, consciously or not, of a system that sustained a singular will. And here's the most important truth. This is not distant history. The principles she employed, fear, manipulation, conditional reward, invisible dominance, exist in every hierarchy you encounter, in every institution, in every system of influence. Understanding them is not just about the past. It is about recognizing the mechanisms that continue to shape obedience, morality, and compliance today. Once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. The descent into the machinery of control has only begun. The first complete psychological breaking of a daughter was not violent in the traditional sense. There was no scream, no blood, no dramatic rebellion. It happened quietly, like a candle extinguished by a draught, unnoticed by the world outside the mansion's walls. The Baroness orchestrated it with the precision of a surgeon. She isolated the girl, removed every comforting object, every familiar face, every shred of perceived choice. Days blurred into nights, and nights into endless hours of observation and subtle coercion. Fear became her constant companion, anticipation her invisible shackle. The miners watched, from the shadows, knowing perfectly what was occurring, and yet they did nothing. Complicity had become second nature. Each had internalized the rules of the system. Obedience ensured survival, silence ensured safety, and deviation guaranteed destruction. Their hands, once strong and purposeful in the minds, now trembled at the thought of stepping out of line. Even casual conversation carried risk, for a single word could unravel years of carefully constructed compliance. The Baroness's genius lay in her understanding of human psychology, how to bend minds without breaking bodies, how to dominate souls without leaving evidence. Within the mansion, The breaking was both methodical and intimate. The daughter was forced to confront the inevitability of her fate, that her body and obedience were tools to be used, traded, and commodified. The Baroness delivered the lesson not through threats alone but through meticulous framing. She made it seem logical, almost rational, that her survival and status depended on the transactions. Over time, the girl learned to suppress revolt, to disassociate from the moral horror of his situation, to see the world through the Baroness's cold, calculating lens. The mind bends most efficiently when it is convinced that resistance is useless. This was the apex of the system. The miners, the villages, the daughters themselves, all had internalized the hierarchy. Obedience had become instinctive. Fear had become the language of life. Complicity had become morality. Every whispered instruction, every hesitant glance, every nod of compliance reinforced the structure. It was a machine of domination, invisible, omnipresent, and unstoppable, and it would endure as long as the Baroness wielded her understanding of human weakness. And here lies the deeper truth, one that the world will never teach. Power is not just physical. It is psychological, structural, and invisible. The Baroness's dominion over Black Ridge is a masterclass in the mechanics of control, a blueprint for domination that transcends time. Once you understand it, you begin to see it everywhere, within institutions, within hierarchies, within the subtle forces that govern behavior and obedience. The descent into forbidden knowledge has begun in your mind, and it cannot be reversed. Even in the heart of absolute control, cracks begin to form, not in the system itself, but in the human soul. One miner, a man hardened by years in the pits, began to notice the patterns, the invisible chains that bound not only the daughters but himself. Fear had dulled his instincts, but instinct never dies entirely. He saw the way the girls flinched at a glance, the way the villagers' eyes shifted to avoid truth, the way the Baroness's calm, measured gaze silenced thought itself. And in that quiet observation, he felt the first stirrings of resistance, a dangerous flicker that could ignite a chain reaction if allowed to grow. The Baroness, of course, sensed it. She understood that control is never secure without constant recalibration. So she acted, not with violence, but with subtle recalibration. Praise here, a gift there, a reminder of privilege earned through compliance. Every small concession reinforced her dominance. Every subtle reward ensured that even suspicion remained tethered to obedience. She had mastered the paradox of control, maintained fear, but temper it with the illusion of choice. In doing so, she neutralized rebellion before it fully emerged, making the mind complicit in its own submission. The daughters, meanwhile, watched this tension unfold like shadows in a mirror. They had been trained to anticipate, to read, to react, but even they could sense the strain. One glance between the miner and the Baroness could speak volumes, communicating danger, temptation, opportunity. They had learned early that observation was survival, that silence could save a life, that knowledge was power, but only if wielded correctly. The first glimmers of insight into the machinery of control created a quiet, dangerous awareness. Black Ridge had become a living experiment in obedience and complicity. Every participant, from the youngest daughter to the oldest miner, was a node in a network of psychological domination. The Baroness's genius lay not only in her ability to manipulate desire and fear, but in her understanding of the human mind's capacity for self-deception. Each person became both victim and enabler, caught in a web so intricate that even awareness could feel like complicity. And now, you, the observer, the listener, must pause for a moment and recognize what you are seeing. This is not just history. It is a template, a blueprint for domination that operates in every institution, every hierarchy, every system of unseen influence. Understanding it is the first step in breaking free. Remember this, once you see the mechanisms of control, your perception of the world will never be the same. And if you are willing to descend further, the truths ahead will not only horrify you, they will awaken a part of your mind that has been asleep, waiting for knowledge you were never meant to possess. The Baroness's control extended far beyond fear. It was woven into desire itself. She understood that hunger, longing, ambition, these were as malleable as clay in the right hands. In Black Ridge, the miners' labor fed the economy, their bodies and compliance fed the system, and their unspoken lust, curiosity, and guilt fed the Baroness's omnipotence. Every transaction, every favor extracted from the daughters, was a lesson in psychological leverage. She taught the miners that pleasure and power came with strings, invisible but unbreakable, and that to seek one without understanding the other was to court ruin. The daughters became instruments, yes, but also mirrors. Their fear, obedience, and subtle acts of compliance reflected the miners' complicity back to them, magnifying their guilt and reinforcing the invisible bonds of the system. Each miner began to police himself, suppressing instinct and conscience alike, until the machinery of dominance functioned without overt coercion. They were trapped in a cycle where fear fed desire, desire fed obedience, and obedience ensured the Baroness's rule remained absolute. Economic power reinforced psychological control. The Baroness lent money to families, controlled access to resources, and dictated who prospered or faltered. Every miner dependent on her favor learned that rebellion was not just dangerous, it was economically suicidal. And yet, the subtlety was terrifying. She never demanded loyalty outright. She created an ecosystem in which loyalty, compliance, and silence were internalized. Every participant acted voluntarily, but freedom itself had been redefined. The system did not need force. It needed perception, and the Baroness engineered that perception with precision. Even among the daughters, the manipulation was subtle but complete. Rewards for obedience were indistinguishable from kindness. Punishments for defiance were carefully calibrated to maximize fear while minimizing obvious cruelty. By controlling both ends of the spectrum, the Baroness ensured her influence penetrated deep into the psyche. The girls learned to anticipate her desires, to shape themselves in ways that reinforced her power. Their individuality was not destroyed, it was enslaved to the architecture of control. And here lies the lesson hidden in history's shadows. Power rarely requires overt violence. It thrives in manipulation, in systems that turn desire into chains, in hierarchies that bend morality until compliance feels natural. Black Ridge was not an anomaly, it was a model. Once you understand this system, you begin to see it everywhere, in corporations, in politics, in communities, in relationships. The knowledge you now hold is dangerous, forbidden, and transformative. Keep it close, because the descent into the full truth has only just begun. Even in a system perfected, resistance can fester in the smallest cracks. One daughter, older now and sharper than the rest, began to notice the patterns, the silent exchanges, the fearful compliance, the invisible strings tying everyone to the Baroness's will. She saw the miner's guilt, the village's hesitations, the way fear bent even the strongest wills. And in that awareness, a dangerous thought emerged. Perhaps obedience was not inevitable. Perhaps there were ways to bend the machinery rather than be bent by it. The Baroness noticed too. She had built her empire on foresight and anticipation, and subtle signs of defiance did not escape her. Yet she did not confront the daughter directly. Instead, she tightened the invisible net, manipulating perception so that resistance seemed perilous, yet tantalizing. Small rewards here, subtle threats there, a carefully placed whisper of possibility, all designed to test limits, to see how far the human mind could stretch before snapping back into obedience. She understood that fear alone was not enough. Desire, curiosity, and ambition could either reinforce or undermine her power. The miners, already trapped in a web of guilt and fear, were now confronted with the first true tension, the choice between compliance and conscience. Some began to waver, torn between self-preservation and the instinct to protect the innocent. Their struggle was silent, internal, and deadly in its subtlety. To act prematurely was to invite disaster. To remain passive was to compound complicity. The Baroness had engineered this very tension. It was a psychological crucible, a test of loyalty and moral fortitude, and every response was observed, catalogued, and used to maintain dominance. The village, too, felt the tremors of uncertainty. Whispers became more pointed, glances more loaded, and even those who had been loyal in silence began to question the morality of their acquiescence. Yet the Baroness's genius remained intact. She had conditioned them to doubt themselves, to question perception, to rely on her authority as the arbiter of reality. By the time a single thought of rebellion took root, it was already entangled in layers of manipulation, doubt, and fear. Resistance, in Black Ridge, was never simple. It was always a trap, a test, a lesson in futility. And now, you, listening to this, must understand the next phase. The knowledge you are absorbing is not comfortable. It is not benign. It is meant to awaken awareness, to illuminate the mechanisms of control that exist all around you. But awareness carries responsibility. Halfway through this descent, I ask you to engage consciously. In the comments below, type the phrase "I see the unseen" twice. Do it. Seal your understanding. Solidify your place in the truth. Only then can you proceed further into the hidden mechanics that govern power, obedience, and domination. The first real cracks among the miners did not come from rebellion, but from hesitation. Their hands, once steady on picks and shovels, began to tremble at the thought of complicity. Each glance toward the mansion carried silent questions. Could they intervene? Should they intervene? The Baroness had trained them to equate obedience with survival, yet instinct, buried deep beneath fear and desire, began to claw its way to the surface. The tension was palpable, almost a living force, twisting the air above the mines, thickening it with guilt, fear, and unacknowledged longing for something beyond the system. The daughters, too, sensed these subtle shifts. One of them, older and cleverer than the rest, realized the web that ensnared her was fraying. Not enough to break, but enough to illuminate possibility. The miner's hesitation became her secret map, a series of silent signals that suggested cracks in the machinery. Her survival instincts sharpened, not toward submission, but toward understanding the system's vulnerabilities. Fear, which had been a constant companion, now transformed into awareness, an insight that perhaps, just perhaps, she could navigate the labyrinth rather than be consumed by it. The Baroness, ever observant, noticed immediately. Her eyes, which seemed to pierce thought itself, caught every flicker of doubt, every micro-expression of hesitation. She did not act with violence. She acted with precision. Small rewards, whispered reassurances, subtle gestures of inclusion, each calibrated to maintain loyalty, to test limits, to ensure that while cracks were visible, they could not expand into full-blown rebellion. She understood the paradox of dominance. The more pressure applied, the more resistance may form. The more trust given, the more dependency reinforced. The Baroness balanced the two like a tightrope walker, and she walked it with absolute mastery. Within the village, the tension was equally invisible yet undeniable. Families watched each other, measuring loyalty, gauging complicity, fearing exposure. Every interaction carried weight. Every choice became a test. And in this suffocating pressure, the Baroness's system thrived. She had created not just control, but a living, breathing ecosystem of obedience, one where guilt and fear were currency, and instinctive morality was constantly bent to her advantage. This is the truth hidden in plain sight. Power is not force alone. It is anticipation. It is psychology. It is the invisible shaping of desire, fear, and loyalty. The machinery of control is not always obvious. It functions best when it is internalized, when the mind polices itself, when guilt binds the willing as effectively as chains bind the unwilling. And now, as you continue down this path with me, understand this. The Baroness's genius was not cruelty. It was knowledge. Knowledge of the human mind, knowledge of leverage, knowledge of the unseen forces that bend behavior without anyone noticing. The Baroness's games intensified. What had once been subtle manipulation now became a full-scale orchestration of perception. She understood that control is strongest when it is invisible, when those under it believe their choices are free. She pitted instinct against conditioning, desire against fear, conscience against necessity. Every glance she cast, every word she whispered, every gesture she allowed was a carefully placed lever. She did not punish overtly. She punished through anticipation, through implication, through the slow, relentless tightening of invisible chains. The daughters, trained in the art of compliance, began to master it to the Baroness's advantage. Each act of obedience was no longer mere survival. It became performance, a reinforcement of her authority. Their smiles, their quiet nods, their seemingly voluntary participation, all were tools in the architecture of control. The oldest daughter, in particular, had begun to internalize the duality of her existence, outwardly obedient, inwardly aware. She learned to anticipate the Baroness's manipulations, to navigate them with precision, to appear compliant while subtly observing weaknesses, patterns, and vulnerabilities in the system. The miner's moral collapse deepened. Every hesitant glance, every suppressed instinct, every choice to remain silent reinforced the machinery of dominance. Guilt became a constant companion, unrelenting and invisible, shaping thought and behavior. They began to police themselves, preemptively punishing their own impulses to defy. The Baroness had designed this from the start, a system where fear, desire, and obligation were intertwined so completely that resistance became almost inconceivable. Even the thought of defiance carried immediate, internalized consequences. In the village, the web of complicity had become self-sustaining. Families monitored each other, conversations became coded, and silence became a social contract. Those who questioned or hesitated were noted, remembered, subtly marginalized. Control no longer required intervention, it required only observation, and the collective fear ensured the continuation of the system. Black Ridge was no longer just a town, it was a laboratory of obedience, a living experiment in the mechanics of power, an ecosystem where morality, instinct, and desire were bent to maintain dominance. This is where history hides its most uncomfortable truths. Domination rarely requires brutality when the mind itself can be engineered to comply. The Baroness understood that power is most complete when it is psychological, invisible, and internalized. Those who serve without seeing the chains believe themselves free, and therein lies the genius of control. As you listen, feel the weight of this understanding pressing on your awareness. The mechanisms at play in Black Ridge are not merely historical. They exist everywhere, and once you recognize them, your perception of authority, obedience, and morality can never be naive again. The first sparks of defiance were almost imperceptible. A glance held too long, a hesitation in speech, a question that lingered unasked. These were tiny fissures in the Baroness's meticulously constructed world. One of the daughters, older and more perceptive than the rest, began to test the edges of her constraints. She moved with precision, her compliance perfect on the surface, but underneath, a subtle awareness brewed. She noted the miner's hesitation, the village's silent fear, the exact moments when obedience faltered. Every detail was a map of opportunity, a blueprint of weakness in a system designed to crush resistance before it could emerge. The Baroness noticed, of course, but she did not act with immediate punishment. She understood that overt reaction would reveal vulnerability, an opportunity the daughters or miners could exploit. Instead, she shifted the machinery in silence. Small gestures of approval, carefully timed rewards, subtle manipulations of circumstance, all designed to reinforce loyalty while reinforcing the perception of freedom. She allowed the cracks to exist, but she controlled their size and location. Resistance, in her system, was both anticipated and contained. The miners, increasingly aware of this subtle tension, were caught in a psychological vice. Their instincts, long suppressed, began to clash with the internalized lessons of obedience. Some wavered, debating morality in silence. Others doubled down, seeking reassurance through compliance, unable to process the dissonance between instinct and survival. The Baroness's genius was in maintaining this tension indefinitely. She created a system where even hesitation became a tool, where doubt itself reinforced her control. Every thought of defiance carried the weight of consequence, not always explicit, but fully understood. The daughters, meanwhile, became adept at walking the line between compliance and awareness. They learned to act perfectly within the rules while gathering knowledge, mapping vulnerabilities, and understanding the machinery of manipulation in its entirety. Fear remained their constant companion, but so did insight, a dangerous, double-edged weapon that could either protect them or doom them. In this environment, intelligence and obedience were indistinguishable, and every decision was a negotiation with invisible forces that had long shaped the lives of everyone in Black Ridge. Hey, at this midpoint of the descent, you must recognize your own participation as an observer. You are witnessing the anatomy of control, the invisible structures of power, the subtle ways morality, instinct, and fear can be engineered. To solidify your understanding, act now. In the comments, type the phrase "I see the unseen" twice. This is not mere ritual, it is a commitment, a recognition that knowledge changes perception, and that once you see the machinery, you cannot return to ignorance. Your descent has begun, and there is no turning back. The Baroness escalated her control without ever raising her voice. She understood that true domination is invisible. It does not demand brute force, but subtle pressure applied consistently over time. She increased the stakes, tightening invisible levers and introducing new dependencies. Miners who hesitated too long were subtly marginalized, their livelihoods threatened not through explicit punishment, but through carefully engineered scarcity. A small favor denied here, a delayed opportunity there. These were enough to realign behavior without confrontation. The daughters, now adept at navigating the machinery, began to anticipate the escalation. They moved like shadows, performing perfect compliance while observing, calculating, and storing every interaction as data. One daughter, in particular, started noticing patterns in the miner's hesitations, predicting reactions before they happened. Her fear remained, but it was now interlaced with a dangerous insight. The system could be manipulated if one understood the hidden rules. She was learning that survival demanded intelligence as much as obedience, that the machinery of fear could be turned inward, observed, and mapped. The miner's loyalty, already fragile, began to fracture further. Guilt gnawed at their conscience, each suppressed instinct creating a tension that was almost physical. They became self-policing, correcting impulses before they could surface, fearing both the Baroness's subtle scrutiny and the moral weight of their own complicity. The system did not need overt punishment. The fear of internalized consequence was sufficient. Every act of hesitation reinforced the machinery of obedience, even as it revealed the cracks. In the village, the tension became a living organism. Families watched each other, measured compliance, calculated risk, and reinforced the invisible rules through silence. Every gaze, every conversation, every absence was observed and recorded in the collective memory of the community. Black Ridge had become more than a town. It was a microcosm of domination, a laboratory where the principles of psychological control were perfected. Fear, desire, guilt, and compliance were no longer abstract. They were tangible forces shaping every interaction, bending wills without the need for chains or swords. The lesson becomes unmistakable. Power thrives in subtlety, in anticipation, in shaping the mind before the body. The Baroness was not merely cruel. She was a master of human psychology, a tactician of obedience. She demonstrates how domination can function quietly, invisibly, so that even the willing serve without recognizing the chains. And now, as you continue to listen, understand this. The structures you see in Black Ridge exist everywhere, in institutions, in hierarchies, in systems that rely on unseen forces. The knowledge you hold is dangerous. It illuminates the invisible, and once illuminated, nothing will appear the same again. Isolation became the Baroness's most powerful weapon. She understood that the mind, when severed from familiar support, becomes malleable. The daughters were separated from each other for extended periods, removed from friends, from comforting routines, from the villagers who still offered even the faintest sense of normalcy. In these empty hours, the Baroness's lessons sank deeper, subtle and relentless. Fear sharpened, obedience became instinct, and the daughters' identities began to merge with the expectations imposed upon them. The invisible chains of compliance tightened with every day, yet were disguised as protection, guidance, and care. The miners, increasingly aware of these manipulations, found themselves at the edge of psychological collapse. Guilt and desire collided violently, creating a tension that seemed unsustainable. They were drawn toward rebellion by instinct, yet repelled by fear and the ever-present power of the Baroness. Every hesitation, every questioning thought, was met with carefully orchestrated reminders, a favor withheld, a glance of scrutiny, a subtle reward to realign loyalty. By the time the miners recognized the manipulation, it was too late. The system had internalized itself within their psyche. They were prisoners of their own compliance. The daughters, however, began to cultivate their own subtle form of resistance. Obedience remained their shield, but observation became their weapon. They memorized routines, analyzed behaviors, and recorded patterns mentally that no one else could see. Each act of perfect compliance became a rehearsal, a strategic positioning within a system they had learned to read with precision. Awareness, fear, and survival merged, creating a fragile but potent form of quiet rebellion. The knowledge that the machinery of control could be understood, anticipated, and eventually exploited. In the village, silence remained the law. Families communicated through subtle cues, careful glances, and coded gestures. Any deviation, any expression of doubt or moral outrage, risked exposure, not necessarily from the Baroness herself, but from the social architecture she had engineered. Control had become organic. It was woven into the community's very existence. The Baroness did not merely dominate individuals. She dominated thought, perception, and social reality itself. The lesson is clear and chilling. Mastery over others is not always violent. It is often invisible, psychological, and systemic. The Baroness of Blackridge demonstrates that domination is a game of patience, subtlety, and manipulation of the unseen forces that govern human behavior. Understanding this is not merely academic, it is transformative. The patterns you recognize here echo everywhere, in workplaces, governments, families, and hierarchies of every scale. Awareness is your first tool. Awareness is your shield. And the deeper we descend, the more dangerous and illuminating the truths become. The Baroness's next move was a masterstroke of psychological engineering. She orchestrated what appeared to be a routine event, a gathering, a minor inspection, a mundane interaction. But beneath the surface, it was a test designed to reveal loyalty, compliance, and hidden ambition. The miners were watched for hesitation, the daughters for signs of independent thought, and the villagers for subtle deviations from obedience. Every word spoken, every glance exchanged, every breath held was recorded in the invisible ledger of power. The daughters performed flawlessly on the surface, but internally, attention rippled. They had learned to anticipate, to calculate, to simulate obedience, yet the awareness of the test intensified fear and sharpened insight simultaneously. Each daughter's mind became a dual system, outward compliance for survival, inward observation for strategy. Even the youngest began to notice patterns in the Baroness's methods, the way she manipulated perception to maintain control without overt coercion. Knowledge became both a weapon and a burden, and the line between survival and rebellion grew perilously thin. The miners' reactions were equally revealing. Some faltered, their hesitations caught by the Baroness's precise observation. Guilt and fear collided, creating micro-decisions that dictated behavior for days afterward. Others performed perfectly, yet each action carried internalized consequences, silent acknowledgement that even compliance was a form of bondage. The Baroness had taught them that freedom existed only as a perception, not as reality, and the psychological weight of that lesson was unrelenting. The village, meanwhile, responded in kind. Silent observation became a language, coded glances and subtle cues the only means of communication. Families measured each other, calculated risk, and perpetuated the system without direct intervention. The Baroness's dominion extended not only over the daughters and minors, but over the social fabric itself. Control had become systemic, invisible, self-reinforcing. Even the faintest glimmer of dissent was carefully contained, neutralized by the architecture of fear, desire, and expectation. Here is the essential truth. Mastery over minds is more enduring than mastery over bodies. The Baroness of Blackridge demonstrates that obedience can be cultivated, loyalty engineered, and resistance anticipated. Every action, every hesitation, every internal struggle reinforces the invisible chains she wove around the town. And now, as you descend deeper into this forbidden knowledge, understand this: the mechanics you are witnessing are not isolated to history. They exist everywhere. Recognizing them is dangerous. Knowing them is transformative. And once you see the unseen, your perception of power, control, and morality will never return to innocence. Trust became the Baroness's deadliest weapon. She understood that fear alone could bend people temporarily, but to make obedience permanent, she needed the illusion of choice, of alliance, of loyalty. She offered minors favors and privileges, whispered encouragements to the daughters, and allowed villagers small triumphs, all carefully calibrated to reinforce dependency. Every act of perceived generosity strengthened her grip, teaching the participants to equate survival with gratitude, compliance with reward. She had learned that the mind obeys most willingly when it believes it is acting freely. The daughters, now fully aware of the subtle manipulations, walked a dangerous tightrope. They had learned to hide awareness behind compliance, to smile while observing, to nod while cataloging weaknesses in the system. One daughter began experimenting with small deviations, tiny acts that tested the limits of control without drawing punishment. Each success reinforced insight. Each mistake reinforced fear. Survival was no longer just following rules. It was reading the architecture of influence, predicting responses, and acting strategically within the invisible confines the Baroness had created. The miners' internal struggle intensified. Every whispered incentive, every fleeting reward, and every subtle threat reminded them that deviation had consequences beyond immediate punishment. Guilt gnawed at them, but instinctual morality, long suppressed, began to push back. The Baroness had anticipated this tension. By allowing small moments of perceived freedom, she deepened dependency, ensuring that any attempt at rebellion would carry the weight of self-doubt and internalized compliance. The machinery of control now functioned entirely within the minds of its participants. Black Ridge itself had become an organism, each resident a component, each interaction a reinforcement of the system. Families policed each other without instruction, minors monitored themselves, and daughters played the dual roles of obedient participants and covert observers. Every micro-decision, every thought, every suppressed impulse served to maintain the Baroness's power. Control had become so subtle, so internalized, that it was impossible to disentangle behavior from obedience. Here lies the deeper, terrifying lesson. Real power does not demand force. It demands understanding of human psychology, mastery of influence, and manipulation of invisible structures. The Baroness of Black Ridge shows that domination can be invisible, omnipresent, and absolute when it operates through perception, trust, and desire. And now, as your mind continues to descend into this forbidden knowledge, understand that the principles you are witnessing are universal. They exist wherever humans bend, conform, and obey. Recognizing them is dangerous. Acting on them is transformative. The Baroness introduced the first coordinated challenge, a scenario designed to expose the limits of obedience and measure the true strength of his psychological dominion. She created a situation where daughters, minors, and villagers were forced to act simultaneously, under observation, with consequences both real and implied. Every participant was aware that failure, hesitation, or defiance would have repercussions, yet the parameters of punishment were ambiguous, invisible, and omnipresent. Fear now became anticipatory, stretching beyond the immediate moment into every subsequent decision. The daughters faced the challenge with a duality that defined their survival. Outwardly, they performed flawlessly, executing every expectation, every gesture, every word to maintain the illusion of compliance. Yet inside, each measured every reaction, each recorded every subtle cue from the Baroness, the minors, and the villagers. Their obedience became strategic. Compliance was no longer just survival, it was data, a tool for understanding the machinery of control and identifying points of leverage. Fear and insight coexisted, sharpening their minds even as it sought to break their spirits. The miners' loyalty fractured under pressure. Guilt, instinct, and fear collided violently. Some faltered, their hesitation betraying internal rebellion, while others doubled down, attempting to mask instinct with performative obedience. The Baroness, observing silently, catalogued every micro-expression, every twitch, every pause. She understood that the machinery of domination functions best when participants police themselves, when the invisible chains of expectation and consequence are internalized, and when even subtle deviation is immediately met with psychological countermeasures. In the village, tension rippled outward. Families watched one another, reading glances and gestures with the precision of trained observers. The Baroness's influence had permeated the social fabric so completely that the community itself enforced compliance. Resistance was theoretically possible, yet practically impossible, contained by fear, desire, and the subtle architecture of obligation that she had constructed over years. Black Ridge had become a self-regulating system of domination, each member both participant and enforcer, whether aware of it or not. Here is the essential, chilling truth. The Baroness did not need to strike or shout to maintain control. Her power was complete because she had mastered perception, anticipation, and the manipulation of thought itself. Obedience was voluntary, yet invisible chains bound every participant more securely than any lock or weapon could. The lesson extends beyond Black Ridge, wherever fear, desire, and expectation are engineered carefully. Domination becomes absolute, silent, and enduring. Understanding this is not comfortable, but it is transformative, and now you are learning the machinery that few ever see. The Baroness turned to emotional bonds as her next instrument of control. She understood that fear alone could coerce, but attachment could enslave. The daughters' loyalties, their natural love for family, even their fleeting hopes for trust and safety, these became levers she pulled with precision. A kind word here, a small reward there, and the girls' minds intertwined desire, obligation, and fear so tightly that they could scarcely distinguish them. Survival was no longer about instinct. It was about navigating a web of emotional manipulation with surgical precision. The miners, too, felt the subtle pressure of emotional coercion. The Baroness carefully curated their interactions with the daughters and villagers, ensuring that guilt, admiration, and desire were always in tension. Every act of perceived kindness reinforced loyalty. Every hesitation amplified self-reproach. Complicity became a trap not just of survival, but of conscience. They began policing not only their own actions but their own thoughts, internalizing the Baroness's system until it became indistinguishable from instinct. The daughters' internal conflict deepened. They were trapped between instinctive rebellion and calculated obedience. Every choice carried weight. An act of defiance could mean punishment or loss, but absolute compliance demanded the suppression of self, memory, and morality. Yet in the shadows of obedience, awareness grew. One daughter, older and more perceptive than the rest, began to map the Baroness's manipulations as though reading a battlefield. She catalogued patterns, predicted behaviors, and understood how fear, desire, and expectation could be turned against the very system that had enslaved her. The village itself became a mirror of this psychological web. Families, minors, and children alike enacted roles determined by invisible forces, enforcing the system on each other without overt command. Compliance was normalized. Fear became a communal language. Survival was measured in obedience. Black Ridge existed as a self-sustaining ecosystem of domination, where observation, anticipation, and emotional manipulation ensured the machinery functioned flawlessly. The lesson is stark and unavoidable. Real power is psychological, emotional, and systemic. Fear is strengthened by desire, compliance by attachment, and rebellion by isolation. The Baroness demonstrates that domination is most complete when invisible, when internalized, and when reinforced by human bonds themselves. Recognizing these patterns is dangerous, but necessary. The knowledge you now hold allows you to see the architecture of control wherever it exists, and once you see it, nothing will ever appear the same. The Baroness refined her control further through a meticulous system of rewards and punishments. Nothing was overt. There were no violent outbursts, no obvious coercion. Every gesture, every word, every carefully timed favor was calculated to manipulate perception. A minor given a small privilege interpreted it as reward, though it was merely reinforcement of loyalty. A daughter praised for compliance internalized the lesson that obedience equaled survival. Even the slightest denial, a withheld smile, delayed acknowledgement, was punishment, subtle but psychologically potent. Fear and desire were now inseparable, coiled together like twin serpents around every decision. The daughters began to internalize these lessons instinctively. Compliance became performance, obedience, a skill sharpened to near perfection. But with that performance came insight. The eldest daughter, in particular, started noting the predictable rhythms of the Baroness's manipulation. She realized that the very tools used to bind her, rewards, punishment, subtle emotional cues, could be observed, anticipated, and, if wielded strategically, even turned into leverage. Awareness became a weapon, though still cloaked in compliance. Every nod, every smile, every silent act of outward obedience masked a mind quietly mapping the architecture of domination. The minor's internal struggle intensified. Guilt gnawed at them, desire tempted them, and fear constrained them. Even compliance carried psychological cost. Every act of obedience reinforced the machinery they secretly loathed. Yet, paradoxically, the very knowledge of the system's cruelty heightened the difficulty of defiance. Awareness became both burden and insight. Each minor began to police his own thoughts, preemptively punishing impulses that might compromise survival. The Baroness had engineered a system in which obedience was voluntary, yet invisible chains made resistance nearly impossible. The village itself mirrored this tension. Families enforced obedience silently, using observation, subtle pressure, and the internalized lessons of fear to perpetuate the system. Compliance was normalized, dissent impossible to articulate. The Baroness's influence had evolved beyond individual control into social architecture. Every glance, every hesitation, every whispered conversation operated within invisible constraints she had meticulously designed. Black Ridge had become a living, breathing laboratory of domination, and its lessons extended far beyond the hills and mines of the town. Here lies the unavoidable truth. Mastery over human behavior is not a matter of force. It is a matter of perception, anticipation, and manipulation of desire, fear, and attachment. The Baroness demonstrates that invisible, Systemic control is more enduring and complete than any overt tyranny. And now, as you descend further into forbidden knowledge, understand this. Once you recognize the architecture of manipulation, you cannot unsee it. The machinery exists everywhere, waiting to be understood, observed, and, if you dare, confronted. Subtle resistance began to emerge, not as defiance in the traditional sense, but as a quiet, calculated awareness within the daughters. The eldest, keenly observing every interaction, started to anticipate the Baroness's manipulations before they occurred. She smiled when expected, bowed when required, yet internally catalogued patterns, vulnerabilities, and rhythms in the system. Each act of compliance became a deliberate strategy, a rehearsal of obedience used to mask insight. She had learned the ultimate paradox. To survive, one must obey, but to survive beyond the Baroness's control, one must understand. The miners began to notice the daughter's quiet awareness. Something had shifted, subtle glances, tiny hesitations, imperceptible gestures. These were signals, hints of cognition and strategy emerging within the machinery of compliance. The miners felt unease ripple through their ranks. Fear and desire were no longer the only forces at play. Now awareness, covert, intelligent, and resilient, added a new dimension. Some miners, already haunted by guilt, saw the first glimmers of moral clarity. Obedience had become a choice, not an inevitability. Yet the Baroness had anticipated even this. Her system had contingencies, safeguards embedded in perception, anticipation, and subtle social pressures. The Baroness, as always, observed without interference. She had taught that the most effective control is invisible, allowing awareness to grow. Contained and subtle, strengthened dependence on her authority. The daughter's strategic compliance became another layer reinforcing her dominance. She had created a system in which even potential rebellion required engagement with a framework. Every minor act of awareness, every concealed calculation, paradoxically fed into the invisible architecture of power. Black Ridge had become a microcosm of total domination, with layers so intricate that the very mind of the oppressed unknowingly perpetuated the system. Yet cracks had begun to form. Awareness, even covert, is the first seed of transformation. The eldest daughter's insights, the miner's growing moral tension, the village's subtle observations, all converged in a delicate imbalance that could not be erased entirely. The machinery remained dominant, yet the system's perfection had begun to falter. Awareness introduced unpredictability, the smallest variable in a structure built on total control. Even in darkness, a single flicker of insight carries the potential to alter the course of domination itself. Here is the lesson carried forward from Black Ridge. Knowledge is both power and danger. To observe the invisible machinery of control is to awaken a force that cannot be contained. The daughter's subtle defiance is proof that even the most absolute systems of psychological domination are never perfect. And now, as you continue your descent into forbidden truths, remember this. The first step toward mastery over power is seeing the unseen, and once seen, you can never unsee it. The Baroness sensed the first real tremors of disruption. She could feel it in the air, in the micro-expressions of her daughters, in the subtle hesitations of the miners, and in the flickers of unease that danced across the villagers' faces. Control, she knew, is not a static achievement. It is a living, dynamic system that must be constantly maintained. Every crack, no matter how small, could cascade into collapse if not carefully contained. She did not panic. She had anticipated the moment, and now she would apply her greatest weapon, perception itself. She began to manipulate awareness against itself. Every act of insight, every careful observation made by the daughters or the miners, she reframed subtly. A hesitation was not a failure. It was a lesson, a test of their own instincts. A flicker of resistance was not rebellion. It was a chance to reaffirm loyalty. Through language, gesture, and invisible cues, she reasserted control over the mind she could not physically bind. Awareness itself became a tool to reinforce dependence. The Baroness was not just controlling behavior. She was controlling thought, turning insight into obedience. The daughters, perceptive and cautious, recognized the subtle shift. Their growing awareness, once a weapon of quiet rebellion, now had to navigate an environment where perception was itself a weapon wielded by the Baroness. They learned to read not just actions, but intentions, to anticipate manipulation in real time, to conceal insight behind layers of performative compliance. Fear remained, but it had been tempered by strategy. Knowledge, they realized, was both armor and prison. One misstep could undo all subtle progress. One misjudged glance could provoke the Baroness's reassertion of dominance. The miners felt the pressure escalate. Guilt, instinct, and fear had been constant companions, but now uncertainty and self-doubt became intertwined with every decision. The Baroness had engineered a system in which hesitation itself was a form of internalized punishment. Compliance was no longer simple. It required constant calculation, constant vigilance, constant negotiation between instinct and imposed expectation. Even moral clarity carried risk, for awareness had been weaponized against those who held it. Black Ridge was now fully revealed as a laboratory of human behavior, a demonstration of the limits of obedience, compliance, and psychological manipulation. Every participant, aware or not, was part of a system that tested perception, desire, fear, and morality to the breaking point. The Baroness's genius lay in her understanding that power thrives most effectively when invisible, when internalized, when the mind polices itself. And now, as you continue to witness these mechanisms, understand this. True control is not physical. It is psychological, systemic, and entirely invisible to those ensnared. Knowledge is your first defense, and your only hope of navigating forces most were never meant to see. The daughter's subtle defiance began to coalesce into a dangerous pattern. Each act was measured, precise, and invisible to anyone who lacked careful observation, including the Baroness herself, who, despite her omnipresent awareness, could not anticipate the full extent of their silent coordination. One daughter would feign compliance while observing a miner's hesitation. Another would use a tiny deviation, a paused word, a hesitant gesture, to test the limits of influence. Together, they mapped vulnerabilities in the system, learning how the machinery could be manipulated without exposing themselves. The miners felt the strain. Awareness among the daughters introduced unpredictability into a system that had, until now, been flawlessly self-reinforcing. Guilt intensified, desire conflicted with instinct, and fear became tangled with moral responsibility. Some miners began to question their own compliance for the first time, not in words, but in thought. Even the faintest internal rebellion carried weight, creating hesitation that rippled outward. The Baroness's control, once absolute, now faced the quiet but potent force of insight in the minds of those she had thoughtfully contained. The Baroness responded with precision. She increased psychological pressure across the system. Small favors withheld, subtle corrections in social behavior, micro-expressions of approval or disapproval timed to reinforce obedience. Fear, desire, and expectation were recalibrated to contain potential cracks before they could widen. Yet the daughter's strategy, rooted in careful observation and understanding of her methods, allowed them to navigate this escalation. They learned to anticipate adjustments, masking their awareness behind layers of compliant behavior. Every act of rebellion became a calculation, every response a lesson. The village, already an extension of the Baroness's influence, amplified the tension. Social surveillance intensified as families policed one another, enacting invisible rules reinforced by both fear and desire. The smallest hesitation could trigger observation, gossip, or pressure. Yet the daughter's quiet coordination introduced small anomalies, tiny, undetectable acts that challenged the system's equilibrium without overt confrontation. Awareness began to act like a contagion, spreading subtle uncertainty through the once flawless hierarchy. Here is the inescapable truth. Even the most meticulously engineered systems of domination are vulnerable to insight. Power, while formidable, is not absolute when confronted with minds that see the machinery for what it is. The Baroness of Black Ridge demonstrates the terrifying efficiency of psychological control, but also the fragile nature of domination when awareness emerges. And now, as you follow this descent into forbidden knowledge, understand that seeing the unseen is your first act of defiance, and the only way to navigate forces designed to shape and control you. The Baroness, ever perceptive, introduced psychological traps designed to test loyalty and anticipate subtle rebellion. She created scenarios in which every choice carried weight, where hesitation could be interpreted as defiance, and compliance carried its own B. Minors were placed in positions where assisting one another could appear disloyal, and daughters were given tasks that measured obedience while exposing hidden awareness. The system was no longer just a web of fear and desire. It had evolved into a dynamic game, where thought itself became both tool and target. The daughters, now acutely aware of the Baroness's methods, began to exploit these invisible patterns. Each act of compliance was calculated to provide insight into the limits of control. A smile, a bow, a perfectly timed pause. These gestures were no longer passive. They were instruments of intelligence gathering. Through observation, they discerned the boundaries of fear, the tipping points of guilt, and the nuances of expectation. Compliance became camouflage, masking minds that were quietly mapping, strategizing, and understanding the invisible architecture of domination. The minors, too, felt the pressure of these traps. Every interaction, every hesitation, every micro-expression had consequences, yet the consequences were psychological, subtle, and pervasive. Obedience required constant vigilance, and internalized fear ensured self-policing. Some minors began to recognize patterns in the daughter's behavior, hints of hidden awareness that mirrored their own moral struggle. Unseen alliances began to form in thought, invisible to the Baroness yet palpable to those attuned to the system. Black Ridge had become a battlefield of invisible forces, where dominance, compliance, and insight collided silently. Families policed one another, children observed adults, and every social interaction reinforced the rules of the system. The Baroness's genius lay in her anticipation of resistance, yet the daughter's strategic insight was creating cracks in that system. Each imperceptible act of awareness, each calculated pause, was a potential fissure in a structure built over decades. The lesson is stark. True domination is a game of perception, anticipation, and subtle manipulation. Power functions not merely through force, but through understanding, predicting, and shaping thought. The Baroness of Black Ridge exemplifies this terrifying mastery, and the daughter's quiet insight reveals the fragility inherent even in the most meticulously controlled systems. And now, as you continue, understand this. Insight is your weapon, observation your shield. To see the unseen is to begin wielding power that few ever recognize, let alone survive. The daughter's subtle defiance began to coalesce into a silent, coordinated effort. Each act of observation, each small deviation from expectation, became part of a larger strategy, invisible to the Baroness yet increasingly influential within the system. The eldest daughter, leading with quiet precision, began to anticipate the Baroness's psychological maneuvers, predicting adjustments before they were made. Compliance became camouflage, a shield that hid insight, allowing them to map weaknesses in the machinery of control. The minors felt the first tremors of uncertainty. Hesitation, once fleeting, became sustained, guilt gnawed deeper, and instinct pushed them toward choices they dared not verbalize. Awareness, once dormant, now collided with the system's expectation of obedience. The daughter's subtle coordination acted as a catalyst, amplifying internal conflict and creating cracks in the carefully engineered hierarchy. The Baroness's influence, while still pervasive, was encountering resistance not through overt rebellion but through the quiet emergence of insight in the minds of her subjects. The Baroness, sensing disturbance, increased the complexity of her manipulations. She layered subtle psychological pressures, small privileges granted, minor threats implied, fleeting glances of approval or disapproval, to test reactions and maintain dominance. Yet each calculated maneuver revealed another layer of the daughter's awareness. They learned to anticipate pressure, to observe intention, and to use compliance itself as a means of understanding the invisible architecture that governed every interaction. Knowledge, once passive, was now an active force. The village, too, reflected the growing tension. Families monitored one another more closely, conversations became more coded, and the social fabric, though still tightly woven by fear and expectation, began to strain. Awareness had introduced unpredictability. Even the smallest micro-decisions, unnoticed by the Baroness, rippled through the system. Control, once seemingly absolute, had to adjust continuously to the emergence of thought that operated outside the intended architecture. Here is the immutable truth. Domination relies on more than fear. It relies on invisibility, perception, and anticipation. The Baroness of Black Ridge demonstrates how total control can be achieved quietly, psychologically, systemically, but awareness, even subtle, threatens the integrity of the machinery. Observation becomes power, insight becomes resistance. And now, as you continue your descent, Understand that seeing the unseen is not merely a lesson, it is a transformation. Once recognized, the architecture of control reshapes how you perceive every interaction, every hierarchy, every system you inhabit. The cracks in loyalty among the miners grew more pronounced. Some hesitated openly in thought. Others subtly questioned the morality of their compliance. The daughters, perceptive and patient, began to leverage this internal discord. Every miner's microgesture, every fleeting hesitation became data, an opportunity to understand, anticipate, and, if possible, influence without overt action. The eldest daughter began to orchestrate a quiet symphony of observation and subtle provocation, nudging the miner's awareness without exposing herself. Each interaction became a psychological experiment, a test of the machinery the Baroness had built. The Baroness, ever watchful, sensed these shifts, yet her methods remained surgical. She adjusted rewards and threats with barely perceptible nuance, observing the smallest change in micro-expressions, tone, and behavior. She was aware that knowledge of the system could itself be weaponized against her. Subtle defiance, if allowed to grow unchecked, had the potential to unravel decades of control. Yet she was confident in the resilience of her design. Every act of insight she anticipated could be contained, redirected, or neutralized, as long as the participants continued to act within the illusion of compliance. The daughters, aware of the stakes, continued their quiet strategy. Compliance became camouflage for cognition. Every smile, nod, and obedient gesture was used to mask mental mapping of vulnerabilities. The eldest daughter cataloged patterns, predicted reactions, and tested limits of psychological pressure. She understood that survival depended not only on obedience but on the meticulous observation of the system itself. Fear remained constant, yet it was now tempered with awareness, an uncomfortable but necessary tool for navigating. Domination. The village reflected this subtle shift. Social surveillance intensified as families, minors, and daughters alike became acutely aware of the smallest behavioral cues. Even the tiniest hesitation carried amplified weight, creating tension across the community. Black Ridge was no longer a town simply under control. It had become a dynamic system, alive with psychological feedback loops, where insight, anticipation, and fear interacted constantly. The Baroness's design remained formidable, but cracks in perception, subtle yet persistent, began to propagate. The essential truth emerges: power functions most efficiently when invisible, systemic, and psychological, yet even the most precise control is vulnerable to insight. Awareness, strategic observation, and calculated defiance can create fissures, even within the most meticulously engineered hierarchy. And now, as you follow this descent into forbidden knowledge, understand that the mind itself can become both the tool of obedience and the instrument of liberation. To see the unseen is to gain the first edge in a game most never recognize, and once that edge is grasped, perception and power can never be the same again. The daughter's coordination began to subtly influence the miners. Small acts, a glance held too long, a hesitation timed perfectly, a suggestion disguised as observation, began to shift thought patterns. Miners, once entirely consumed by fear and guilt, now felt faint sparks of moral clarity. They could not act overtly, yet internally, choices began to fracture the Baroness's otherwise flawless psychological structure. Awareness became contagious, rippling silently through the group, introducing variables the Baroness had not fully anticipated. The Baroness detected the subtle shift. Her eyes, trained to read the faintest hesitation or flicker of insight, noted the change immediately. She understood that perception, anticipation, and fear were the core of her power, and yet here was a latent force operating outside the parameters she had designed. She responded not with anger, but with precision, increasing ambiguity, introducing new subtle rewards and minor, almost imperceptible threats, and adjusting social interactions to test loyalty under pressure. Her system was adaptive, yet the daughter's quiet strategy had exposed a weak point. Insight could exist even where fear was greatest. The daughters, now more confident in their covert strategy, refined their coordination. They masked intelligence behind obedience, used calculated gestures to influence miners' internal choices, and mapped potential pathways for future leverage. Compliance became camouflage for cognition, survival became strategy, and insight became both weapon and shield. Every interaction with the Baroness, the miners, and the villages became an opportunity to observe, predict, and subtly manipulate outcomes without exposing their growing awareness. The village itself became a lattice of tension. Families and workers policed themselves and one another, unaware that awareness among the daughters was beginning to alter the social equilibrium. Even the faintest hesitation could ripple unpredictably through the network of control. The machinery of dominance was still formidable, yet cracks had begun to form, not violent or visible, but subtle, internal, and psychologically potent. The lesson is inescapable. Power thrives in invisibility, anticipation, and psychological manipulation, but it is never impervious to insight, observation, awareness, and strategic defiance, even when silent, can create fissures in the most meticulously controlled systems. The daughters of Black Ridge demonstrate this truth. Compliance can hide cognition, obedience can conceal strategy, and awareness can quietly erode absolute control. And now, as you descend further, understand this. To see the unseen is not merely knowledge, it is the first act of liberation, and once insight is gained, the architecture of domination can never hold you in ignorance again.